power corrupts, but absolute power reveals the true nature of a man's soul. In the gilded halls of medieval England, where whispers carried more weight than swords and a single decision could reshape kingdoms, King Henry VIII faced a choice that would echo through centuries. The year was 1536, and the man who had already shattered the foundations of the Catholic Church for love was about to demonstrate that even love has its limits. Behind the ornate doors of Hampton Court Palace, a conversation was about to unfold between a king drowning in paranoia and his most trusted enforcer, a conversation that would seal the fate of a woman who had once held the heart of England in her delicate hands. What happens when absolute power meets absolute betrayal? When love transforms into something far more dangerous than hate? This is not just a story of royal intrigue. This is the true account of how a king's obsession with securing his legacy led him to order the execution of the very woman he had moved heaven and earth to marry. This is the story of Anne Boleyn's final days, told through the eyes of those who held her life and death in their hands. The morning mist clung to the Thames like a shroud as Sir William Kingston adjusted his leather gloves and prepared for what would become the most consequential conversation of his career. As Constable of the Tower of London, he had witnessed the rise and fall of many nobles, but nothing had prepared him for the events that were about to unfold in the spring of 1536. Kingston had served 3 monarchs faithfully, but Henry VIII was unlike any ruler he had known. The king who had once been hailed as the most learned prince in Christendom had transformed into something far more dangerous, a man whose paranoia grew like a cancer, feeding on his desperate need for a male heir and his increasing isolation from the world he ruled with an iron fist. The seeds of the tragedy that would soon consume the court had been planted 6 years earlier, when Henry first laid eyes on Anne Boleyn at a court function. She was not the most beautiful woman in attendance that evening, but she possessed something far more potent than mere beauty, an intelligence that sparkled in her dark eyes and a confidence that set her apart from the simpering courtiers who usually caught the king's attention. Anne was different from the start. While other women at court played the game of subtle seduction, dropping handkerchiefs and casting meaningful glances, Anne Boleyn played chess. She understood that Henry's interest was piqued not by availability but by challenge, not by submission but by the thrill of conquest. When the king sent her gifts, she returned them with polite notes explaining that her honor was not for sale. When he wrote her passionate letters, she responded with wit and intelligence that matched his own. The court watched in fascination as the most powerful man in England found himself in the unfamiliar position of pursuer rather than pursued. Henry, who had grown accustomed to having his every desire fulfilled with a mere gesture, discovered that Anne Boleyn would not be conquered so easily. This resistance only inflamed his passion further. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and a man whose rise from humble beginnings had sharpened his understanding of power's mechanics, observed these developments with the calculating eye of a chess master. He recognized that Anne represented an opportunity, a chance to finally resolve the king's great matter of annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Where Cardinal Wolsey had failed, perhaps a woman's influence could succeed. The political implications were staggering. Henry's marriage to Catherine had produced no surviving sons, only the Princess Mary. The king's desperate need for a male heir was not merely personal vanity, it was a matter of national security. England had endured the devastating Wars of the Roses when the succession was unclear, and Henry lived in constant fear that his death without a male heir would plunge the realm back into civil war. Anne understood the game being played better than perhaps anyone realized. She was not merely a beautiful woman seeking to become a royal mistress, she was positioning herself to become queen. Her family, particularly her ambitious father Thomas Boleyn and her uncle the Duke of Norfolk, saw in Anne's relationship with the king a chance to elevate their standing at court and accumulate the wealth and power that came with royal favor. The transformation of Henry's character during this period was remarkable and disturbing. The young king, who had once been praised for his scholarship, his athletic prowess, and his apparent devotion to his wife Catherine, began to show signs of the paranoia and cruelty that would mark his later reign. His pursuit of Anne became an obsession that consumed not just his personal life but his approach to governance. When the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the king made a decision that would reshape English history forever. Rather than accept papal authority, Henry chose to break with Rome entirely, establishing himself as the head of the Church of England. This was not merely a religious reformation, it was a political revolution that gave Henry unprecedented power over his subjects' lives and souls. Thomas Cranmer, the ambitious cleric who became Henry's Archbishop of Canterbury, understood that his elevation depended entirely on his willingness to validate the king's desires. When Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn in November 1532, after she finally became pregnant, Cranmer provided the ecclesiastical authority to declare the union valid while simultaneously annulling Henry's marriage to Catherine. The coronation of Anne Boleyn as Queen of England in June 1533 was a spectacle designed to demonstrate the legitimacy of Henry's new order. The king spared no expense, creating a pageant that would convince his subjects that this marriage had divine approval. Yet even amid the celebrations, there were ominous signs of the instability that would follow. The child that Anne carried, the heir for whom Henry had risked everything, was born in September 1533. The court held its breath, waiting for the announcement of a prince. Instead, they received word that the Queen had delivered a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. Henry's disappointment was crushing, though he attempted to maintain public optimism about future sons. Anne's position at court, which had seemed unassailable during her rise to power, began to show cracks almost immediately after Elizabeth's birth. The king's passion, which had burned so intensely for 6 years, began to cool as the reality of his situation set in. He had defied Pope and Emperor, split his kingdom from Catholic Christendom, and faced rebellions from his subjects, all for a woman who had given him another daughter rather than the son he desperately needed. The Queen's sharp tongue and quick temper, traits that had initially attracted Henry as signs of her intelligence and spirit, now began to irritate him. The royal court, always a place of shifting allegiances and whispered conspiracies, sensed the change in the king's attitude toward his wife. Ambitious courtiers who had once sought Anne's favor began to distance themselves, while others started positioning themselves as alternatives to the increasingly isolated Queen. Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne, represented everything that Anne Boleyn was not. Where Anne was dark and dramatic, Jane was fair and submissive. Where Anne challenged and debated, Jane listened and agreed. Most importantly, Jane came from a family that promised the possibility of the male heirs that Henry craved above all else. Thomas Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, began to see the political advantages of removing Anne from the equation. The Queen had made enemies among the old nobility who resented her family's rapid rise, and her failure to produce a son made her increasingly vulnerable. More dangerously, Anne had begun to interfere in matters of state, offering opinions on foreign policy and religious matters that encroached on areas Henry considered his exclusive domain. The king's growing paranoia found fertile ground in his deteriorating relationship with Anne. Every miscarriage, and there were several after Elizabeth's birth, was seen as evidence of divine displeasure. Every political setback was blamed on the woman whose influence had led him to break with Rome. The man who had once moved mountains to marry Anne Boleyn began to see her as an obstacle to his legacy rather than its foundation. By early 1536, the atmosphere at court had become poisonous with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Anne, sensing the shift in her husband's affections and the growing threats to her position, became increasingly desperate in her attempts to regain the king's favor. Her efforts often backfired, making her appear manipulative and calculating to a man whose patience had worn dangerously thin. The Queen's sharp intelligence, which had once charmed Henry, now seemed threatening to a king who tolerated no challenges to his authority. When Anne dared to criticize some of his policies or express opinions that contradicted his own, Henry saw not the passionate engagement of an intelligent partner but the dangerous interference of a woman who had forgotten her place. Kingston, observing these developments from his position at the Tower, understood that the currents of court politics were shifting in dangerous directions. He had seen enough rises and falls to recognize the signs of an impending catastrophe. The question was not whether Anne Boleyn would fall, but how spectacular that fall would be and who would be caught in its devastating wake. As winter turned to spring in 1536, the pieces were already in motion for one of the most shocking episodes in English royal history. The king who had once declared that he would rather lose his crown than give up Anne Boleyn was about to demonstrate just how completely love could transform into something far more dangerous. The spring air of 1536 carried an electric tension through the corridors of Greenwich Palace as Thomas Cromwell prepared to orchestrate the most audacious political maneuver of his career. The king's chief minister had built his reputation on his ability to solve Henry's problems with ruthless efficiency, but the challenge before him required a delicate balance of timing, manipulation, and calculated brutality that would test even his considerable skills. Cromwell understood that removing a crowned queen from power required more than mere political maneuvering. It demanded the complete destruction of her character and the careful construction of charges so serious that even Henry's former passion for and could not protect her. The minister had observed the king's growing disenchantment with his wife, but he also knew that Henry's pride would never allow him to admit that his great love affair had been a mistake unless he could convince himself that he had been the victim of deception. The opportunity Cromwell had been waiting for presented itself in an unexpected form. Mark Smeaton, a young musician who had caught the Queen's attention with his skill at the lute, had been noticed spending increasing amounts of time in Anne's private chambers. Court gossips whispered about the handsome commoner who seemed to enjoy unusual favor from the Queen, but Cromwell saw something far more valuable than mere gossip. He saw the foundation for charges of adultery that could bring down not just Anne but anyone associated with her. Smeaton's humble origins made him the perfect target for Cromwell's purposes. Unlike the noble courtiers who surrounded the Queen, the young musician had no powerful family to protect him, no network of allies to rally to his defense. When Cromwell's agents arrested him on May 1, 1536, Smeaton found himself completely alone against the full weight of the king's justice system. The interrogation of Smeaton was conducted with the methodical precision that marked all of Cromwell's operations. The young man was not merely asked to confess to adultery with the Queen, he was systematically broken down through a combination of psychological pressure, physical discomfort, and promises of mercy that would never be fulfilled. By the time Smeaton finally signed his confession, he had also implicated several other men in the Queen's circle. The names that emerged from Smeaton's forced confession were carefully chosen to maximize the political impact of the scandal. Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool and one of his most trusted courtiers, represented the betrayal of personal friendship. William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, had accumulated enough enemies through his arrogant behavior to make him a believable villain. Francis Weston, young and handsome, fit the profile of someone who might catch a queen's wandering eye. Most shocking of all was the inclusion of George Boleyn, Anne's own brother and a man whose closeness to the Queen could be reinterpreted through the darkest possible lens. By adding charges of incest to the already explosive allegations of adultery, Cromwell ensured that the scandal would be so heinous that even Anne's supporters would find it difficult to defend her. The speed with which these arrests unfolded was breathtaking in its efficiency. Within days of Smeaton's confession, Cromwell's network had gathered what they claimed was sufficient evidence to charge all the accused men with high treason. The legal framework they employed was ingenious in its simplicity. Adultery with the Queen was treason because it potentially compromised the royal bloodline and succession. And herself remained unaware of the trap closing around her until it was too late to escape. The Queen was at Greenwich Palace, participating in the May Day celebrations, when she noticed the unusual tension among the courtiers. Her husband's behavior had been strange for weeks, alternating between cold indifference and barely concealed hostility, but she attributed this to his ongoing frustration with Parliament and the various political challenges facing the kingdom. The first sign that something was catastrophically wrong came when Anne noticed the absence of several regular members of her household. When she inquired about Henry Norris, she was told that he had been called away on urgent business. Similar explanations were offered for the other missing men, but Anne's sharp intelligence began to detect a pattern that filled her with growing dread. Kingston received the order to prepare the Tower for high-profile prisoners on May 1, though the full scope of what was planned remained unclear to him at the time. As Constable of the Tower, he was accustomed to receiving political prisoners, but the secrecy surrounding these particular arrangements suggested something far more significant than routine detention. The king's behavior during this period revealed the psychological complexity of his character. Henry had convinced himself so thoroughly of Anne's guilt that he genuinely believed he had been the victim of an elaborate deception. His former passion for his wife transformed into something far more dangerous, a wounded pride that demanded not just revenge but complete vindication of his own judgment. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury who had validated Henry's marriage to Anne, found himself in an impossible position. The same man who had risked his career to support the king's break with Rome now faced pressure to declare that marriage invalid. Cranmer's attempts to defend Anne were met with such royal fury that he quickly understood his own position depended on his willingness to abandon the woman he had helped elevate to the throne. The legal machinery that Cromwell set in motion was designed to produce only one possible outcome. The courts that would try and end her alleged accomplices were staffed with judges who understood that their own survival depended on delivering the verdicts the king expected. The concept of justice as an independent force separate from royal will was a luxury that Tudor England could not afford. Anne's own family, recognizing the shift in political winds, began to distance themselves from the doomed queen with shocking swiftness. Thomas Bullen, her father, made no attempts to defend his daughter when it became clear that association with her meant political suicide. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle and one of the most powerful nobles in England, actually participated in the judicial proceedings against her. The Queen's isolation became complete when even her own servants were questioned about her private life and relationships. Every conversation, every gesture, every moment of privacy was re-examined through the lens of the charges against her. The sophisticated court culture that had celebrated wit, intelligence, and sophisticated flirtation was suddenly recast as evidence of moral corruption and political treason. Jane Seymour's role during this period was carefully orchestrated by her ambitious brothers, who understood that their family's future depended on their sister being ready to step into the role of queen the moment Anne was removed. Unlike Anne's dramatic rise to power, Jane's ascent was managed with quiet efficiency, presenting her as the virtuous alternative to the allegedly corrupt woman she would replace. The psychological pressure on Henry during this period was immense, though he showed little outward sign of emotional turmoil. The king who had risked everything to marry Anne Boleyn was now being forced to confront the possibility that his great love story had been built on lies and manipulation. Rather than admit the possibility that he had made a mistake, Henry chose to embrace the narrative that cast him as a deceived victim rather than a discredited lover. Cromwell's genius lay in understanding that Henry needed to be given a story that preserved his dignity while eliminating the obstacles to his future happiness. The charges against Anne were crafted not just to remove her from power but to provide Henry with a psychological framework that allowed him to move forward without admitting error or weakness. As the legal proceedings moved forward with predetermined efficiency, Kingston began to understand the full scope of what was being planned. The Tower of London, which had housed many political prisoners over the centuries, was about to become the stage for one of the most dramatic royal executions in English history. The constable who had served 3 monarchs faithfully found himself preparing to oversee the destruction of a woman who had once been hailed as England's queen. The speed with which these events unfolded left little time for reflection or second thoughts. Within weeks of the first arrests, the entire structure that had supported Anne Boleyn's reign was dismantled with surgical precision. The woman who had once seemed untouchable in her power found herself completely alone, facing charges that would almost certainly result in her death. The king's final decision was approaching, and Kingston knew that when it came, he would be the one responsible for carrying it out. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him as he made his preparations, knowing that history would judge not just Henry's decision but also the men who made it possible. The Tower of London had never felt more imposing than on the morning of May 15, 1536, when Sir William Kingston received word that the king wished to see him privately. As he walked through the ancient corridors toward his fateful meeting with Henry VIII, Kingston carried with him the weight of centuries of royal justice, but nothing in his long experience had prepared him for the conversation that was about to unfold. Henry stood alone in his private chamber, staring out at the Thames through a window that offered no comfort in its view. The king who had once radiated confidence and majesty now appeared diminished, though no less dangerous for his apparent vulnerability. The man who held absolute power over millions of lives was about to exercise that power in its most terrible form. Kingston had witnessed the trial of Anne Boleyn 3 days earlier, a legal proceeding that had been orchestrated with such precision that its outcome was never in doubt. The Queen had faced her accusers with remarkable composure, denying all charges with a dignity that had impressed even her enemies. Her defense had been eloquent and passionate, but, in a court where the verdict had been predetermined, eloquence was merely a final performance before the inevitable conclusion. The king turned from the window as Kingston entered, and the constable was struck by the transformation in Henry's appearance. The jovial monarch who had once delighted in tournaments and festivities had been replaced by a man whose eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had convinced himself that mercy was weakness and sentiment was dangerous luxury. Henry spoke without preamble, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who had wrestled with his conscience and emerged victorious over any lingering doubts. The order he gave Kingston was delivered with bureaucratic efficiency, but its implications were staggering in their finality. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, mother of the future Elizabeth I, was to be executed within the week. The king's justification for this decision revealed the psychological complexity of his character during this period. Henry had managed to convince himself that Anne's alleged crimes were not merely personal betrayals but threats to the very foundation of his kingdom. In his mind, the woman he had once loved passionately had become a source of political instability that had to be eliminated for the good of England. Kingston listened to the royal command with the professional detachment that years of service had taught him, but internally he grappled with the magnitude of what was being asked of him. He had overseen the executions of nobles before, but never a crowned queen, never a woman whose marriage to the king had been celebrated with such public ceremony and whose fall from grace had been so precipitous. The practical arrangements for Anne's execution required careful consideration of both security and symbolism. The king was determined that the event should serve as a definitive statement about the consequences of betraying royal trust, but he was also conscious of the need to maintain some semblance of dignity in the proceedings. The execution would take place within the Tower grounds, away from the public crowds that might complicate the political message Henry wished to send. Henry's decision to import a French executioner, skilled in the use of a sword rather than the traditional English axe, was presented as a mercy to and but actually served the king's own psychological needs. The foreign expert would ensure a clean, quick death that would minimize the potential for the kind of gruesome spectacle that might generate sympathy for the condemned queen. Anne's behavior during her final days in the Tower demonstrated the remarkable strength of character that had first attracted Henry's attention years earlier. Rather than collapsing under the weight of her circumstances, she maintained her dignity and wit even while facing death. Her conversations with Kingston revealed a woman who understood exactly what was happening to her and why, but who refused to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her break. The Queen's primary concern during her imprisonment was not her own fate but the future of her daughter Elizabeth. Anne understood that her execution would bastardize the child and potentially exclude her from the succession, but she also hoped that Henry's paternal affection might protect Elizabeth even if his hatred could not save her mother. These concerns revealed the depth of Anne's political understanding and her recognition that her personal tragedy was part of a larger struggle for dynastic control. Kingston found himself developing an unexpected respect for the woman he was preparing to execute. The sharp-tongued queen who had made enemies throughout the court showed remarkable grace under impossible circumstances, displaying the same intelligence and courage that had elevated her to the throne. Her composure in the face of death made Kingston's task more difficult, as it became increasingly hard to see her as the villainous seductress described in the charges against her. The king's visits to Jane Seymour during Anne's imprisonment revealed the calculating nature of his emotional life during this period. While his wife awaited execution in the Tower, Henry was already making arrangements for his next marriage. The speed with which he moved from condemning into courting Jane demonstrated that his decision about Anne's fate had been driven more by political calculation than by genuine belief in her guilt. Thomas Cromwell's satisfaction with the success of his scheme was evident in his increased influence over royal policy during this period. The minister who had orchestrated Anne's downfall found himself elevated to new heights of power, becoming the king's indispensable problem solver and the architect of a new kind of royal authority that brooked no challenges or complications. The reactions of foreign ambassadors to Anne's impending execution provided insight into how the rest of Europe viewed Henry's transformation from Renaissance prince to despotic ruler. The imperial ambassador reported to his master that the English king had become unpredictable and dangerous, willing to destroy anyone who inconvenienced him regardless of previous affection or obligation. Anne's final letter to Henry, written in her cell in the Tower, was a masterpiece of dignity and restrained accusation. Without directly challenging the charges against her, she managed to convey both her innocence and her understanding of the political forces that had brought about her destruction. The letter's tone suggested that she saw through the facade of legal proceedings to the personal and political motivations that truly drove her prosecution. The morning of May 19, 1536, dawned clear and cold as Kingston made his final preparations for the execution. The French executioner had arrived and tested his sword, ensuring that the technical aspects of the event would proceed without complications. A small crowd of witnesses had been assembled, carefully chosen to include representatives of the various court factions but small enough to prevent the gathering from becoming a public spectacle. Anne's final moments demonstrated the same composure that had marked her imprisonment. Dressed in a grey gown and, displaying no signs of the terror that might have been expected, she delivered a brief speech that acknowledged the king's authority while subtly maintaining her innocence. Her words were carefully chosen to avoid giving her enemies any additional ammunition while preserving her dignity in the historical record. The execution itself was carried out with professional efficiency, lasting only moments and causing minimal suffering. The French swordsman's skill ensured that Anne's death was as merciful as the circumstances allowed, though the symbolism of the event was unmistakable. The woman who had once held the heart of England in her hands died alone, abandoned by almost everyone who had once sought her favor. Kingston's role in these events haunted him for the remainder of his career, though he never publicly questioned the king's decision or his own part in carrying it out. The professional soldier who had served 3 monarchs faithfully found that some orders, even when lawfully given and dutifully executed, carried a weight that could never be fully set aside. Henry's reaction to news of Anne's execution was carefully managed to project appropriate royal dignity while concealing any personal emotions he might have felt. The king, who had once written passionate love letters to Anne Boleyn, received confirmation of her death with apparent indifference, immediately turning his attention to preparations for his marriage to Jane Seymour, which took place just 11 days later. The broader implications of Anne's execution extended far beyond the personal tragedy of one woman's fall from grace. Henry's willingness to execute a crowned queen sent a chilling message to the entire nobility about the limits of royal mercy and the dangers of displeasing the king. The England that emerged from this crisis was a more dangerous place for anyone who aspired to influence or proximity to the throne. Thomas Cromwell's triumph in orchestrating Anne's downfall established him as the most powerful man in England after the king himself, but it also set a precedent that would eventually contribute to his own destruction. The minister who had shown Henry how effectively inconvenient people could be eliminated would later find himself on the receiving end of the same ruthless efficiency when his own usefulness came to an end. The execution of Anne Boleyn marked the end of one of history's most famous love stories and the beginning of a new phase in Henry VIII's reign, one characterized by increasing paranoia, isolation, and willingness to use violence as a tool of statecraft. The decision that Kingston had been ordered to carry out was more than just the elimination of an inconvenient queen. It was the moment when Henry VIII fully embraced the absolute power that would define the remainder of his reign and shape the future of England for generations to come.